Hello again, everyone. This is the recorded lecture for Chapter 7 regarding families. I'm actually re-recording this one because I'm hoping to cut down on the length of time that I devoted to this lecture in previous semesters. The issue I run into with many of these courses is that I have, over the years, taught entire semesters on certain topics that I am now compelled to reduce to 45 to 75 minutes in a single lecture. And this is one of those topics. I've taught courses on marriage and family at Kenai Peninsula College in a classroom a number of times. And so there are many things that come into my mind as I touch on these topics. This is a really big overview of this topic. And so I feel as though I'm skating over a topic that really deserves a lot more discussion. But the consolation I take in this is that I know that most of you, many of you, maybe all of you have had courses regarding marriage and family and these sociology courses over the years, as well as social work courses, so that you may already have a lot of this information anyway. But just so you understand why I get very wordy sometimes. So first of all, just a few things to talk about the family in broad and general terms so that I'm sure we're all on the same page about what we're talking about. The textbook points to the fact that there are 3 different ways of forming families, and that is, of course, biologically, legally, and socially. The social form of family involves fictive kin and chosen family, and this is becoming more and more important in our world as individuals choose not to marry and live with a partner per se, and oftentimes rely upon close friends and such in their day-to-day living for helping with their family duties. And in more traditional cultures, and including our Alaska Native cultures, fictive kin have a much more important role in the lives of families and children than they do in the more, say, modernized Western culture. Family is defined in the textbook as a social group of 2 or more persons characterized by ongoing interdependence with long-term commitments that stem from blood, law, or affection. That's a very broad definition, but it's one that I think takes in just about all the different kinds of family systems that we might imagine. So a couple of basic terms about family. First of all, we know monogamy means that in such a culture, only one spouse is permitted at a time. There is such a thing as serial monogamy, and I've heard once said that Americans believe so much in monogamy that they get married over and over and over again, which there is some truth to that. But in any event, the key here is this one spouse at a time. Polygamy is more than one spouse at a time. This is not something that's practiced by and large in our culture. It is at different places and different cultures around the world, but not within our own culture. And you know about bigamy, of course, is being married to 2 spouses at a time, but we're not touching on that here. Also, exogamy and endogamy. This is how we pair up, so to speak, how we choose our mates. And in society, there are rules about who can be your mate. In an exogamous society, all mate pairs must be outside of one's group. And in endogamous, then the pairing is inside of the group. These groups involve such things as, say, religious leanings, social class, age, race, relation, gender, those kinds of things. And so in America, we tend to think of ourselves as more of an endogamous culture in that usually the expectations are that we pair with inside our group. The expectations in this particular area have relaxed considerably over the last several decades and within my lifetime, really. For instance, America has been thought to be endogamous in terms of religion, social class, age, and race. The expectation has been that you marry or that you pair up within your group in each of those areas. Now, of course, there are many more interracial marriages and interracial relationships than there once was, and it's becoming increasingly accepted, except for perhaps the old guard. And if you think in terms of the old guard, we're still very, very endogamous. The expectation has been in many religions, for instance, that you marry within your religion. Social class, oftentimes, if anyone marries outside of social class, it kind of raises eyebrows, although there's nothing illegal about doing so. The one area where I think this culture remains staunchly endogamous is age, that the expectation is that you marry somebody reasonably close in age to yourself. if I were to pair up with a 19-year-old woman, I would raise a lot of eyebrows. There would be nothing illegal about it, but everybody would be thinking of me as a dirty old man. And that includes people in my own age group as well. Age is still one of those areas where we're very, very careful about endogamous pairs. But we are also exogamous in this culture. For one thing, we are not to marry within our relatives, within our relation group, to a degree of first cousins. Now, there are many cultures where marriage is even preferred within the range of first cousin, not siblings, but first cousins, for reasons that have to do with inheritance and family ties and those kinds of things. Certain cultures in the Middle East and in Asia actually encourage endogamy in terms of relationships, but America is, generally speaking, is exogamous in terms of relationship with pairing up. Another area where we have been exogamous over the years, which again is beginning to be loosened up, is in terms of gender and sex. That it used to be that you never married within your own sex. Now this has become legal and is becoming increasingly acceptable socially, although again I will say the old guard continue to reject those changes. So American society, you can say, is both endogamous and exogamous. Several definitions of family. Here's a handful of them that have been selected, and I would just refer you back to these slides in order to, or at the textbook, to look at this more closely. I think you notice, for one thing, that there's an emphasis on social groups, networks, those kinds of things that, again, expand the definition of family beyond blood relationships. And that's something that remains relatively new in our society and our culture. Adoption and fostering children have been around for quite some time also, however, but a lot of people tend to think of family as persons they're related to by blood, and this is certainly an outdated idea about family. If you look at the Census Bureau takes a kind of a clinical look at things that says a group of two or more people who reside together and who are related by birth, marriage, or adoption. So it is still very narrowly defined as far as the purposes of the census is concerned, whereas other sociological and anthropological definitions of family are much broader. Historically, the concept of family has evolved, and this is something that would actually make a very interesting research project for a master's or doctoral student, I think, someday, is just to trace how the notions of family have changed, both within our own culture as well as, and this primarily focuses upon North America, even beyond that in other parts of the world, how the definition of family has evolved over time. Before the first contact with European settlers, Native American peoples, there were 2,000 cultures, all with different customs and lifestyles, independent and not related at all to what we think of today in terms of a family system. When the white settlers came from Europe, it's indicated here there were 4 waves of settlers through 1775. Each of those waves brought with them its own customs, practices, and attitudes about family. The Industrial Revolution reshaped the family in that we had previously in America been very much a family-based small economy where most of the work was done at the home and or in cottage industries out of the home. But the families stuck together, lived together, worked together. But with the Industrial Revolution, then separate spheres of influence developed, and men sort of got the dominance over the sphere of work outside the home, although many lower-class women did go off to work in factories, particularly in the textile industries. But men were seen to be the dominant gender in the outside world, and women continued to focus upon taking care of the hearth and home. By 1950, the idea of family and really the whole definition of marriage and why marriages happen and what people expected of their partners evolved again. And by 1950, you kind of had that Ozzie and Harriet and Father Knows Best sort of ideal family image that was being broadcast in early days of television, where the home, the family, was a place of retreat and a source of emotional support and guidance. And of course, we still look to the family for that purpose, but times have changed a lot. And with the 60s and the onset of the feminist movement, the revitalization of the feminist movement, and also the advent of easily accessible birth control, gender roles were very much challenged and life changed for families. And oftentimes now we have 2 working parents, sometimes by choice, sometimes not by choice, but out of necessity, economic necessity. But women now are very much involved in the world outside the home as well. There are further evolutions in more recent times, again, in terms of same-sex marriage is becoming more accepted and acceptable as well. So you see the whole concept of the family evolves and isn't something that's static. The textbook talks about 5 different perspectives of understanding the family theories, and so we're going to spend a little bit of time on each one of these perspectives. First, the psychodynamic perspective really focuses upon family of origin issues. You're probably familiar with that term. When there are unresolved problems in family of origin, that they continue to be a source of current personal and interpersonal problems. If you have unresolved issues with your father or your mother, it can impact your relationship with other adults of same or different gender. And this is something that's fairly well accepted in much of the therapeutic world. Unresolved issues are acted out in the current intimate relationships, according to this theory. Murray Bowen is a theorist who was deeply studied and talked about the differentiation of self. This, I think, arises from the 1950s and 60s, I believe, is when his teachings or his theories were most deeply studied. He believed that there should be a differentiation between thinking and feeling, that we should think and plan at times that call for clear thinking rather than reacting emotionally. Now, there is some, I believe, Western influence as well as some patriarchal influence on that statement, I believe, but nonetheless, that's the bend in this particular theory. Also, he said that a healthy family would have a differentiation between the self and other members of the family, that individuals in the family should follow their own beliefs rather than making decisions in relationship and reactions to others, and instead of seeking their approval. When we talk about the concept of the authentic self and how that figures into our emotional health and our mental health, this is something that I think relates to that, because oftentimes we adopt beliefs and act in certain ways in order to please other members of our family, seeking the approval of that. And that's created by the way the family is structured. We're raised to seek the approval of our parents, and it's very difficult for many of us to let go of that need as time goes on. And so sometimes, rather than being our authentic selves in our lives, we choose to follow the patterns that we've been taught to follow. And Bowen thought this was not healthy. And then triangulation is another concept that comes out of his studies, where a two-person emotional system in stress and difficulty would inappropriately engage a third person in order to manage that stress. And so there's a triangulation that is involved. A good example of that is with acting out adolescence. Oftentimes you find in those homes that the marital relationship has a great deal of difficulty that is being brushed aside and not tended to. We kind of forget about it because you're dealing with the errant behaviors of that teenager. And so the parents can pull together to try to focus on that teenager rather than dealing with the struggles within their own relationship. And this is why you may have noticed oftentimes when the last child leaves the home is a time when there's a particular crisis in marriages that have hung together through the years, more or less, for the kids. When the last child leaves, sometimes the marital couple is left to resolve those issues among themselves and don't have the skills or the will to do that. And sometimes that's when separation occurs. Concept of a genogram, and this is a visual representation of the family's composition and structure. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going into this. You're familiar with genograms, I would imagine, and they can really tell you a lot about yourself and your family system. And I've seen genograms used in many, many different ways. It's not simply a family tree, but you can use genograms to trace positive things as well as negative things. For instance, alcoholism, oftentimes you can find it throughout your family tree. Certain beliefs about self you can trace back through the family. One of the things that we learned in my family therapy class in my graduate studies was that the naming of children oftentimes carries significance, so that what we find sometimes when you study family trees closely is that when a child is named after an ancestor, say a couple generations back, as that child matures, oftentimes that child displays many of the same behaviors and qualities and characteristics of that ancestor. The idea is that the family gathers around that particular name and winds up shaping that new personality to be similar to the person that they know with that name. It's just kind of an interesting concept. And again, I've been reading some journals from our Alaska Native classmates this semester also that talk about the importance of names and tying back into previous generations as well. A genogram just really gives you a chance to trace really whatever you want to trace back through your family, and it can be a great opportunity to learn about yourself and the influences, how the family influences through generations, the behaviors and adjustments of individuals. A family systems perspective, rather than looking at the individual, focuses upon the relationships within the family system. If you think of the ecosystem theory that we work with, the client's relationship with outside individuals, outside influences in that ecosystem, the family systems is sort of that same perspective, but within the family unit. There are certain qualities and characteristics that families develop, such as boundaries, that delineate who is in the family at any given time and who is not. And also there are boundaries within the family itself that develop subsystems like child subsystem and the parent subsystem, or the men and the women. And how those boundaries are, both within the family as well as around the family and the outside world, oftentimes can create a healthy family system, or it can create some serious dysfunction in the family. So boundaries are there, and they can be healthy boundaries. They're permeable, and they allow influences to cross over those boundaries. Ideas and exchange of communication can go back and forth through those boundaries. But if they're a closed family system, those boundaries are rigid, then no information can go back and forth, and that tends to be a very unhealthy kind of arrangement. So that's one thing you look at when you're looking at family systems theory. So the theory here is that changing the patterns of interactions between and among those family members will help to address the problems of whatever individual brought the family to our attention. So this is something that's oftentimes used, again, I'm thinking about acting out adolescence, because that was a lot of the work I engaged in over the years. Instead of just focusing on curing this acting out girl, look at what's going on with her in relation to her families and work on the relationship between the parents and that girl. A multi-level family practice model also widens its focus to include larger systems in which the family is embedded, and that includes things like the neighborhood, the local community, and so on. Now, that is sort of, again, going back to that ecological person and environment theory that we lean on in social work. And an eco map, which is another tool that we can use very effectively in working with families, helps us to assess how a family connects to those larger systems outside. When you do your case studies, you should be including an eco map. That's part of the directions for that activity. The feminist perspective looks at patterns of dominance, subjugation, and oppression in families, so that gender is seen as a primary characteristic and power is distributed and misused in a family system based upon gender. So they look at such things as how society assigns male and female characteristics and roles, and how women's and children's views of family life may differ. How family practices create advantages and disadvantages based upon gender, raises questions about caregiving responsibilities in families. Of course, we know very well that in our society, women are expected to be the primary nurturer in the family system, again, in a typical sense. And this is one reason why women wind up earning about 77% of what males earn in the work world, because they're oftentimes called away from work to tend to the needs of the family, and this intrudes in their ability to advance in their profession. And also calls attention to the family as the site of both love and trauma. And we'll talk a little bit about that trauma a little later on here. Add to this the concept of intersectionality, which considers that belonging to other minority groups impacts women even more, both in terms of oppression and in terms of privilege. The family stress and coping perspective uses an ABCX model. A is an event in a family system, and X is a crisis, so that A may become a crisis, and we need to understand the family's resources, B, and the family definitions of the event, C, in order to determine what the outcome will be. So if we're trying to reduce the impact of a crisis, let's say, or an event such that it is not a crisis, where the work would be then implied by this is looking at the resources the family has to pull in to address the event, as well as the definitions of the event itself. And this very much goes back to cognitive theory, as I'm sure you have already noticed, so that really adaptation to stressors oftentimes is based upon what meaning is attributed to the event. What do we say to ourselves? What does the family say to itself about the event? And is it something that is going to spell the end of the family unit, or is it something that is recoverable from? After that stressful event, there is a period of disequilibrium as the family gathers itself around, marshals its resources, maybe works through its definitions of the event, and then there's one of three outcomes depending upon B and C, which is either recovery to the previous level of functioning, maladaptation, which is a permanent deterioration in the functioning of the family, or bonadaptation, which is an improvement about the family's previous functioning. And that's a key point to help families understand that an event occurs that leads to a crisis can become an opportunity for improvement in how that family relates. That's something perhaps to help the family marshal the resources in a positive way so that stressful events can wind up becoming beneficial. That's a part of redefining that attribution as to the meaning of the event. There are different kinds of stressors. There are those normative stressors that are typical of the family life cycle, children leaving home, a birth, a new job, let's say, a marriage. There are also non-normative events that I think in general tend to create more of a disequilibrium, at least initially. Things like, unemployment, catastrophes, medical issues, and so on. When a series of crises pile up, that's called stress pileup, as you might expect, would deplete resources even more and increase the likelihood of negative outcomes. And we're going to take a look at kind of how to map that out in a moment with families. The key to this is that lower levels of stress, but persistent stress, can also create stress pileup. And I think about poverty and poor families and chronic nature of that poverty and the kind of stress it creates can be oftentimes as debilitating as any kind of catastrophe that comes around. So the family timeline can be used to help the family identify similar events from their past and to discover resources that they use to pull them through. And so this is half of you'll see here in the next page that this timeline continues. I couldn't squeeze it onto one slide and make it readable. This is in your text. It's Exhibit 7.4. You see here where they've mapped out different events in this family's life cycle. Births, work, those kinds of things, accidents, illnesses, military service, et cetera, et cetera. And so these kinds of things are the kind of events or crises that are notable in a family's life. And some of those may create more of a disturbance than others. And so one of the things you want to do as you map that out is to find out how the family dealt with each of those events and that kept them going. And at times when they feel as though they've reached a crisis that is tearing them apart, maybe you can go back to a similar event in the past and find some of those resources and some of those ways that the meanings that they attributed to those events and help them rework all of that to bring them to a point where they're functioning more successfully again. This can be a very useful tool. Just like the eco map, just like the genogram. Visuals sometimes help a lot of people understand things better. Another perspective is the family resilience perspective, which considers the processes that allow a family to bear up and rebound from distress. Families can be seen as being challenged by an event and not damaged or disabled by them, and can be seen as having the potential for repair and growth instead of bouncing back from an event, bouncing forward, going beyond restoring to previous functioning, but being even better yet. And there are certain things that contribute to resilience. Again, when you think about this in terms of individuals, we've talked about children who are resilient, and it's much the same concepts. First of all, what are the belief systems within the family? Resilient families make meaning of adversity as they see it as a challenge that they share together. It's not something that is bound to disrupt and destroy the family. Also, resilient families have patterns of organization that serve as shock absorbers, whatever that might be, how families respond to these events, these shocks, let's say, to the system. And that might be reaching out to relatives and asking for assistance from outside. It could be just family meetings and how individuals within the family organize around the event and talk things through. And then that leads to the communication processes where resilient families have clear, consistent, genuine messages and engage in problem solving together. They collaborate in their problem solving. And this is also true in terms of marriages. Studies time and time again show that couples who describe their marriage as happy aren't always happy and never have a problem. They often have many problems, but what they do is they face the problems together and they talk about them when they're small. They don't deny them, they don't hide them until they become so big that it's difficult to deal with. But they're constantly working through issues on a day-to-day basis. And those are the couples that are shown to be successful over and over again in studies. We confront problems, we talk them out, we deal with them, we don't deny them. And so the same thing can be true for a family system as well. A little bit about diversity in family life, and none of these particular groups are anything that would be surprising to you, I'm sure, but I just want to touch on each one a little bit. I know the text does, and just kind of highlight a couple concepts from each of these groups. First of all, the nuclear family, as societies become urbanized and industrialized, this is sort of the trend around the world as far as how families form. This is mother, father, children, as you know, or corollary depending upon particular makeup of the family. In many respects, smaller families are more practical. Doesn't mean they're better in all areas, but in some respects, they may be more practical. And this has been, of course, the preferred American model. But it's an ideal that is difficult to accomplish and to succeed in because it creates some sense of isolation with individuals and puts pressure, especially on the spousal relationship, to fill each other's needs. This implies that there isn't a regular connection with individuals outside of the nuclear family, in the strict definition of this term. And so you can see that the pressure is on the individuals within that family system to cope with everything. According to the Census Bureau in 2012, 20% of the households in the United States were married couples with children. That's essentially the nuclear family. That was down to 19% in 2017, but in 1970 it was 40%. So you can see that the nuclear family is becoming less and less common in the United States, now maybe 1 in 5, whereas before it was almost half. And yet this is the family that we tend to see as the typical American family and sort of the model that we hold ourselves up to, unrealistically. Extended families really have more of a connection to the more traditional agrarian economies, and this is where the parent-child nuclear family lives alongside other relatives, such as grandparents, aunts and uncles, adult siblings, cousins, and they rely upon the resources in the extended family to cope with different crises and things like this. So, for instance, a teenage boy is having a conflict with his dad or doesn't have a good role model, his father. He can find his grandfather or an uncle and create a bond and utilize that relationship as a male role model to help him cope with all those kinds of things. And that's just one example. Mothers can rely upon their sisters or their own mothers to help them understand how to deal with certain situations or emotional responses to things. Likewise, with fathers can rely upon other members of the family to help them deal with certain things that they're responsible for as well. Financially, it's more practical in many respects. It allows for emotional support, but it does impose some upon individuality. And so oftentimes Americans, because we're so mobile in this society, we pride ourselves on being independent, and that is sort of a quality, that rugged individualism, right, that we talked about early in the semester in our American values. And again, that creates a lot of strain on individuals. And so the extended family can make up for that, but sometimes at the expense of individuality and independence, perhaps. The text thinks that the contemporary family is a modified extended family model. Although we may not live together with our relatives, still we're very involved with each other for emotional and economic support sometimes. The middle-class white Americans tend to have weaker extended family systems than most other groups in the United States. Cohabitating heterosexual couples living together in a romantic relationship without marriage, and it doesn't necessarily mean it's romance. Sometimes it can be for economic, practical reasons as well. The theory has always been that cohabitating couples are testing out their relationship and that if they get through that, then they're more successful in their marriage. But the fact is, the statistics have demonstrated that, in fact, couples that have lived together before marriage have a higher divorce rate than those that did not. And that's counterintuitive in many ways. The thought is that it is that way because, and this is just a theory, but that couples who live together without marriage have less of a commitment to the institution of marriage itself. And so not only do they delay getting into it for the purposes of living together and their sexual interactions and raising kids together, also they find it easier to walk away from because they don't have that commitment. That's one theory about that. But it is a counterintuitive notion. Childless or child-free couples is the term now. Child-free removes the connotation that the couple lacks something because they don't have children. In the U.S. and other wealthy nations, there's an increase in the proportion of married couples who have no children. And this is actually a trend that started in the late 19th century and continued to exist really until somewhere after the Second World War, early 1950s, where we begin again to have that nuclear family of father knows best as the model with 2.2 children. There are different types of childlessness, of course, and again, child-freeness, I suppose, is a better term, temporary, voluntary, and involuntary. Involuntary childlessness is something that is a major source of stress for many couples. Husbands and wives have different reactions to it. Women, I think, feel as though somehow because of traditional expectations of being a mother in our society, that somehow they're not fulfilling their female role, let's say, in some respects. And men oftentimes see it as a threat to their masculinity. We all have these hang-ups based upon our traditional masculine and feminine socialization patterns in this nation. And there's still some stigma attached to childlessness, although I think it's, again, child-freeness, although I think that's beginning to pass some. Interesting, lone parent families as opposed to single parent families. One parent with at least one child. You can see here that about a third of the children lived with one parent in 2012. There was actually a fair amount less in 2017. I'm not sure how to explain that. In just 5 years, 5% difference. That's kind of surprising to me. Most of these children live with their mother as opposed to a single father. But the rate of lone parent or single parent families has tripled since 1970. Again, another trend I think that has a lot to do with the feminist movement and redefinitions of gender expectations and gender roles that have occurred, redefinitions of gender roles since the 1960s and 70s. Single mother homes are especially vulnerable to economic insecurity and poverty. You can see there 51% versus 8% in Denmark. And this is why in my social welfare class, we talk about poverty being really a women's issue primarily, because the most families that are in poverty are led by single mothers. Other nations have better systems for providing for families than we do. You look to Scandinavia, for instance, for some good examples. And here's Denmark, for instance. You see there 8% poverty with single mother homes in Denmark versus 51% in the United States. There are other models of dealing with poverty and gender roles that are far more functional, and we would do well to shape our own policies around them. Instead, we look at enforcing child support and encouraging the single parent to marry. Step family is another variation on families and two adults and children where one parent is not the biological parent. There are about 10 to 20% of children younger than 18 living in step families. The family structures in these systems are very complex. Oftentimes, children are visiting with the other parents. Some of them are moving back and forth. Sometimes they have shared custody, sometimes not. And even within the step family itself, there can be very conflicting loyalties and divided loyalties. And in some situations, the step parent assumes fully the role of the parent as he would if he or she were biological, and others as a more limited role. Same-sex partner families. Of course, you know of the changes both with DOMA being struck down in 2013 and then Obergefell case in the Supreme Court in 2015, where the Supreme Court essentially said that it was unconstitutional to deny the right to same-sex marriage, made it legal in all 50 states. I still think this is a decision that is under threat in our society. The very conservative courts that we have these days, and there are many efforts by the states in bringing this back before the Supreme Court, hoping to get these decisions overturned. But this is where we stand at the present time. There are a lot of ideas about same-sex marriages and how it impacts the children, but most of them are bogus. You know, there's no indication that children growing up with same-sex parents differ in any important way from other children, and they're no more likely to identify as homosexual themselves. The same-sex couples themselves oftentimes report less conflict than heterosexual couples, more satisfaction in their relationship, an ability to resolve conflicts more successfully, and also less traditional division of labor patterns in same-sex couples as opposed to heterosexual married couples. Military families are mentioned here. In a modified sense, I would also like to mention, for the purposes of Alaska, those slope families as well, although it's far less of a pronounced absence. But slope families also experience that back and forth where one parent is present in the home and then isn't, and then is, and then isn't. My dad worked in railway mill service as I grew up, and it was gone a week and home a week and gone a week and home a week. And really, well, the expectations were the same for us, but it was a very different family until my father retired when I was in middle school, but throughout my childhood. With military families, of course, the separation is longer. Oftentimes, there are very, very special challenges faced in times of deployment. The spouses of active duty soldiers and reservists that have been deployed report loneliness, loss of emotional support, overload in roles, and worry about the safety and well-being of the deployed spouse. There are differences in the experiences of active duty and reservist families, and this is something to keep in mind, that active duty families live in or near military institutions during the family member's deployment. At least they have the ability to do that, and so they can have ongoing support from other military families as well as from the military programs that reservist families don't necessarily have, because they're scattered across all the states and territories. Many of them live in rural communities and lack those resources and support of other active duty families. And so that's just another consideration. We have relied upon reservist call-ups in many situations. And when the deployment period ends, 3 of the 4 military families report that the first 3 months after coming home can be the most stressful period, as the family readjusts to the presence of the military member and the roles get realigned once again. A little bit about economic and cultural diversity. Of course, the richest and poorest Americans, there's a gap that's growing and has been growing ever since the 1970s. And it's not the first time this happened. This also occurred during the Gilded Age and around the turn of the last century, where there was this great gap in services, and resulted eventually in the Progressive Era, in part at least. That was the cause of the Progressive Era. The models that are mentioned in the text focus upon the economic stress that leads to pressure upon the family and the distress in the parental relationship and disrupts family relationships. Families with greater economic resources have the ability to afford to make large investments in the development of their children that poorer families do not. That just only serves to further widen the gap between the richest and the poorest in America. There are many different cultures in American society, and across cultural groups, the families are going to differ in terms of how they define the family, how they organize their family life, and will have many, many differences in customs and traditions and communication patterns. And it's really up to us, as a part of culturally sensitive practice, to be curious and open-minded. What the authors refer to is informed, not knowing, an informed, not knowing stance in approaching these families, so that we should know the limitations of our own cultural perspectives, to have a healthy respect for the integrity of every culture, to learn as much as we can about the families from other cultures that we see, and also to keep in mind that while we may know something about the group as a whole, there are more variations within every cultural group based on all these social factors: class, rural, urban, education, documented, not documented, religion, those kinds of things. There are more variations within each cultural group than there are between that cultural group and mainstream America. So that's a very important thing to keep in mind. Don't stereotype and generalize what we think we know about other cultural groups. Immigrant families in particular, in 2011, about 40 million immigrants were living within the U.S., about 13% of our population, and they may be documented, they may be undocumented, and they're here for economic reasons oftentimes because they have other family members here, sometimes because they're refugees from crises in their homelands. The dominant countries of origin for our immigrants, as you know, throughout our history, vary across time. Oftentimes they're influenced by our own immigration policies. There's a difference between the generations, of course, within immigrant families. First, second, and third generations, they all have different experiences. And also another thing that is different among immigrant groups is when the immigration occurred into the United States. And so some groups, the immigration occurred during a period of time when they were welcomed into society. At other times, it occurred at times when they weren't. Sometimes they came under different economic circumstances. So the experiences of immigrants is very heavily impacted by the history of the immigration of that group and that person. And so that's another thing to know, is when did they come? All immigrants don't have the same experience coming here. Some immigrant families, particularly those from south of the border, but also from the Middle East now, are moving sequentially so that the children might be left behind for some time. And when they get here, they have some difficulty reattaching to their parents. Another thing that tends to happen, another phenomenon, is that children often learn the language in the new culture more quickly, and that oftentimes puts their parents in a situation of role reversal, and it's something we should be very careful about. For instance, they may make good interpreters for their parents, but that in some families, that can really upend the authority structure in the family. It can be an insult, and so we have to be very careful about utilizing the services that younger children can provide to us to help us communicate with the older generation. And of course, the difference between families who arrive here from collectivist cultures coming into this very individualistic culture is something that can make immigration even worse. I'm not going to spend much time talking about family violence issues here, but so family violence, of course, involves intimate partner violence, child maltreatment, elder abuse. Part of this grows from our culture's tendency to accept and even encourage violence for many reasons, including a way to settle disputes. Our gender socialization and traditionally encourages aggression as a strong male characteristic and passivity as a positive female quality. It's something that makes a woman more feminine. All sorts of things increase the risk of violence, including intergenerational modeling and isolation and stress. Sometimes removal is necessary in these situations, but not all. But when the violence escalates to a danger level, it becomes imperative. One thing I want to point out to you, the textbook does say that couples therapy can be appropriate in cases of mutual violence. I want to tell you that most DV shelters and treatment programs for the treatment of DV strongly recommend against couples therapy until the batterers have gone through and successfully completed a batterers intervention program. So be careful about offering couples therapy when domestic violence exists. Now, this talks about mutual violence, and what we consider mutual violence often is one batterer and a victim defending generally herself, and it can be misinterpreted as mutual violence, but be very, very careful about offering couples therapy in these situations, because what can happen is we, as therapists, we encourage open communication, and so if the victim in that relationship communicates openly and everything's fine in the session, when that victim gets home sometimes she can get the hell beat out of her for speaking up. So be aware of that. Lifetime probability of divorce in the U.S. is still about 50%, but it's lower for more recent marriages. Now, 50%, this isn't like individuals, 50% of individuals who marry get divorced, but rather 50% of marriages get divorced. So this also includes second and third marriages as well. And second and third marriages are shown to be more likely to end in divorce than first marriages. Might be a surprise to you, I don't know, but again, it might be about the commitment to the institution, like we were talking about with cohabitation. But another thing is that studies also show that when a first marriage ends, if the individuals in that marriage don't face up to each of their own responsibilities in that failure of that relationship, and both partners pretty generally have a role in that, so that if the individuals in that failed marriage, that ended marriage, do not recognize and acknowledge their own mistakes, they're likely to repeat them in subsequent marriages. That's what I've learned. There's a lot of debate about the consequences of divorce, and with children and things, there's been a lot of awfulizing about that. And I think in the end, what we find is that if the child can maintain a positive relationship with at least one parent, and hopefully both parents, and if the parents are able to communicate with each other even after the divorce doesn't have to have terrible consequences on the children. Again, that's for a marriage and family class. Substance abuse is another class in and of itself, another semester here. But 1 in 4 American children are exposed to family members' alcohol abuse. That's one of the adverse experiences in ACEs study. And you see a strong association between excessive alcohol consumption and intimate partner violence. But remember that substance abuse is not a cause of intimate partner violence. And that's one of the things that batterers are often going to say is, I was just so drunk, I lost control. Lots of guys get drunk, and again, I'm saying guys because they're typically the batterers, get drunk and they don't beat their wives. They don't beat their intimate partners. There's something different that occurs here, whether they're drunk or not. It isn't about the alcohol. So for social work practice, remember just to assess your families from a variety of those theoretical perspectives. Be particularly aware of the impact of changes in the larger systems on families' resources and functioning. Understand the diversity in family structures that come with different cultures that are in our society today, and be sensitive to the differences in the strengths and weaknesses of each of those structures. Know how economics impact family system, and be aware of cultural diversity among families, and maintain a commitment to culturally sensitive practice. You're always going to be a learner when you approach families in general, particularly families from other cultures. Remember, you're a learner as you enter into that family system. Use appropriate tools in helping families, and when families do well, give them credit for struggling well in adverse circumstances. Again, Not that they're not struggling, but that they're struggling well. That's something that deserves a pat on the back. Policy always has something to do with our work, and just be aware of that and stay tuned and aware of what's going on. And encourage family members to be involved in their own communities and states and national efforts for positive change, and work towards your agencies becoming involved in policy and advocacy work on behalf of families as well, including developing new programs and services that are needed. That's it. And I know I came in less time than the previous one, probably still not as short as I wanted it to be, but I hope that there's some useful information here. And let me know if there's anything in here that spurs thought, or if you'd like to discuss any of these topics more. This is another one of my favored topics, I suppose, and I'm always happy to talk about it. Thanks very much for listening.